This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we cannot thank you enough. My guest today is a political psychologist teaching at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He's a senior research associate at the Psychology of Intergroup Conflict and Reconciliation Lab and a research fellow at the Harry S. Truman Institute for the Advancement of Peace, both at the Hebrew University. He now has a new book out, and it is as timely as ever. It's titled Hope Amid Conflict, Philosophical and Psychological Explorations. It was published just this month by Oxford University Press. Dr. Oded Adomi-Leshem, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hi, thanks for inviting me.
So the book is essentially about the existence and function of hope in intractable conflicts. Professor Daniel Bartal, who's the chief theorist of intractable conflicts and who also wrote the foreword to your book, was a guest here a few months ago, so I won't ask you to delve too deep into what an intractable conflict is, and listeners are encouraged to dig into our archive, not very deep, but listen to my interview with Bartal. But going back to intractable conflicts, aren't they defined precisely by the absence of hope? Isn't it a contradiction in terms of some sort?
Right. So the term is a bit, I wouldn't say it is misleading because it touches a very fundamental part of the conflict, which is that the people that are involved in this conflict perceive it as innately irresolvable. So one of the things that we see, and this is kind of across time, when we survey Israelis and Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, we see that their belief in the likelihood of peace is very, very low, right? And it shouldn't surprise us because indeed the conflict has been going on for so long.
Well, they have ample reasons to believe that.
Exactly. But what I would say is the important thing is that this belief in itself is detrimental. Because if we believe that there is no chance whatsoever for any type of resolution of the conflict, there is no reason for people to engage or elites to engage in any pro-peace activity or thinking. And, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, and then the conflict just perpetuates.
So what is really the function of hope in intractable conflicts, given that this is the case?
Right. So first of all, one of the things that I offer in the book is a new way to understand hope and to conceptualize and understand what it is. And hope is actually made of two dimensions. There are two dimensions that are, or two components that are a part of hope. The first is our desires, aspirations, dreams, wishes, right? And the more we want something, the more we aspire for it, the more we hope it will happen, right? We don't hope for things that we are indifferent to or that we don't want and aspire for. And that's one dimension. That's a very important dimension. And the second dimension is how much we think these aspirations are going to materialize, right? The chances or the assessment of the likelihood that our wishes will come true. And this is the more cognitive dimension, while the first dimension is more motivational. And many times when we think about hope, we think only about the second dimension, right? How much we think that peace is impossible. And as we know, peace is, regarded as something almost impossible by Israelis, Palestinians, international actors as well. But when we look and we measure how much people desire peace, so the motivational component of hope, how much they aspire for it, we see that actually both Israelis and Palestinians highly desire peace. And when I talk about peace, I provide all sorts of definitions, but across definitions, we see that peace is something very desirable, but believed to be unattainable.
Yeah, but the question is fundamentally, and I think really is how you operationalize the concept of hope, as operationalize as you social scientists like to call it. Really, you have these two components, but of course everybody wants peace. The question is what you do with it.
Right. So I'll start by answering your second question. Not everybody wants peace. Okay, we could see in the data, okay, and I just yesterday checked data that I collected in the Gaza Strip. This is a representative sample of almost 400 Gazians a year and a half ago. And not everybody wants peace, and I provide all sorts of definitions. And this is also true for Jewish Israelis. Many Jewish Israelis don't think that peace is a desirable outcome.
Just want conflict to go on?
Or not necessarily, or they want, complete exclusion of the other party, right? Or kicking them out or destroying them, etc. The concept of peace, which in some ways means addressing, the needs of both parties such that they could live in security, etc., okay, is something that most people want. Most Israelis, most Palestinians, but not all people. So not all people desire peace, and this is something we need to know about. And I think, the examples, what we see, what we saw in the 3 weeks ago, etc., or 4 weeks ago when on the 7th of October shows that not everybody wants peace. And there is also from the Israeli side also some peace.
The question is really how you define peace, because if you ask them whether what's peace for them, they would say it's the complete annihilation of the other party. Probably that's how they understand peace, which is a definition that you probably don't accept for good reason, but it is.
Right. So, for example, we say that's a good question, and now I also turn to how I operationalize hope. So, for example, for the definition of peace as peace is security and safety for Israelis and independence and liberty for Palestinians. If I provide this definition and then I ask, and I want to understand how much people hope for that, I ask them, how much do you wish this thing? So what are the levels of your desires that peace that will give security to Israelis and independence for Palestinians? What are the levels of your desires? And then I ask how much you believe is this possible, right? And so this is a definition that does not include, annihilation of the other party. It includes something that both party needs. And again, I see that across the board, most Gazians, most Palestinians in the West Bank, most Jewish Israelis desire this very much, okay, but think that it is impossible. One of the things that I try to promote in the book more philosophically is how we build our hopes not only on the expectation dimension. So if we only kind of build or base our hopes only on how much we believe something is possible, we're not necessarily are going to achieve anything. But we put more emphasis on our desires and aspirations for something, then we might kind of advance. And I would even say that humanity's achievements from the beginning are actually based on how much people desire and aspire for something rather than if they think that it is possible.
Now this opens really many avenues for discussion, and I start trying to think which one I should address first. But I think that what you just said really attests to the fact that hope is essentially even a biological and evolutionary defense or survival mechanism, right? I mean, it is, as you say, where there's people, there's hope in a way. I mean, even in the darkest and bleakest hours of humanity, and we know that from also recent examples, there's a lot of inspiring and examples of the creation of hope, even in completely impossible situations. So really, how do you beef up that desire aspect of hope? What is really required to address it in a more beneficial way?
Yeah, so even let me address first your first comment. So first of all, this is very, very true. When everything is nice and fine and dandy, hope is not very relevant. It's relevant, but its power doesn't really manifest. But, in dark hours, in times of crisis, in times of unrest, hardship, then hope becomes what it is, right? A motor or a driver for something. It's like think about like a small flame. It's really irrelevant if the room is full of light, right? But if the room is dark, the flame, the little flame of a candle is very powerful, is very relevant, right? So that's one thing. And we see it, there are examples in history, but also philosophers of hope talk about that very much. So Erich Fromm and others that studied hope say, hope is, the origin of hope is pain and suffering. This is where it starts. But also in terms of evolution, this is really interesting because there is one kind of theory or approach that says that humans' overestimation of their success is actually what propelled, advanced technological advancements and other, social advantages across time. So this thing is in many ways evolutionary. People need this kind of hope and need to believe in their success, and that kind of propels human advancement across time.
Yeah, but the question is really in the context of conflict, how do you overcome all the detrimental factors that play into it, especially in intractable conflicts that have this sort of like axiomatic understanding or fateful even about the reality of the conflict and some sort of immutable characteristics of the players, especially the other side.
Right. So first of all, it's very difficult. Okay, let's not think that the kind of inspiring hope and using hope to advance some sort of conciliation in Israel-Palestine is something easy. It's actually very challenging, but in order to do that, we need to think about several things. First of all, this idea of reminding us about our desires, our goals, our aspirations for some sort of coexistence. And again, I can't underestimate this. This is across the board, right? Most Israelis, a huge percent of Jewish Israelis and Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip aspire for some sort of solution, a resolution that will address the needs of both peoples. Okay. This is from recent data that I collect in both regions, large-scale samples, representative, etc. If we remind ourselves that this is the case, then that's a start, right? We desire and aspire. I also, by the way, it's not an anecdote, but I have studied the perceptions of what's called meta-perceptions, how much Jewish Israelis think the Palestinians hope for peace and how much Palestinians think that Jewish Israelis hope for peace. And there is an underestimation, right? People underassess the levels of hope of their rivals, and that directly influences their own hope. So people say, they don't hope for peace, why should I hope for peace, right? So this meta-perceptions or underestimations are also detrimental. You need to understand that the other side, there are many challenges, we can't be naive, but the other side aspires for some sort of resolution, and this is the first thing that we might do. Okay, so basing our hopes on the desired component. The second is to find, small examples that show the possibility, right? So we know that there are, and these are very challenging times right now, but there are initiatives, there are programs, there are binational organizations that are working, and when you go to these meetings or you go to these activities, you see like a miniature example of what the future could look like. Okay, so you actually experience and the possibility of resolution in this area.
What do you think really is the role of the leadership here? I mean, I was reading your book, I kept thinking about, the role of hope in politics, and then, suddenly was reminded that this was perhaps the single most recognizable slogan of Barack Obama, right? Hope.
Yeah, the audacity.
And I think that now that you say about this microcosm of conflict resolution and how to extrapolate it to the macro level is really where leadership comes in, right? I mean,
or doesn't.
Or doesn't. No, it should come in.
Should come in, exactly. Yeah, so there is a full chapter in the book which talks about elite politics and whether they adopt what's called the politics of hope or the politics of skepticism. So the politics of hope is, like you said, it's something that we kind of intuitively understand. It's where politicians encourage people to believe that the future will be better and encourage them to work together, to achieve these goals. This is Barack Obama and Martin Luther King and others. These are really, hope-driven politics. But there is also another type of politics, which is the politics of skepticism, when leaders in many ways discourage people, and in the case of Israel-Palestine, discourage them to believe in a better future, that between the river and the sea. And this chapter it does two things. First of all, historically analyzes the dynamics of these politics in Israel-Palestine. And for example, if we talk about the Israeli leadership, the aspiration for peace was something, very deep in the ethos of Israel for many, many years. Up until about 20 years ago, even though the belief in the possibility was kind of, depending on the situation, the aspiration for peace was clear and was advocated by leaders, very clearly and explicitly. But in the last 20 years, this disappeared. And what actually the leadership of Israel has been doing is advocating for the impossibility of peace, right? Saying this is impossible, right? And in many ways discouraging. So this is the politics of skepticism. The second thing we did is a student of mine, Ilana Ushmersky. She analyzed all the speeches made in the United Nations, in the General Assembly, in the opening debate of the General Assembly, of Palestinian leaders and Israeli leaders, and counted the implicit and explicit expressions of hope for peace among Palestinian leadership and among Israeli leadership. And for example, for the desire component, for how much leaders express their desires and aspirations for peace, we see that Palestinian leadership did it more than the Israeli leadership. And perhaps this is also because the conflict is asymmetrical and, perhaps Israel doesn't need peace that much. Maybe now the things are changing. But
and this is perhaps the reason why the politics of skepticism was so successful, because, there wasn't this urgent need for...
exactly.
For even a rhetoric of peace. I want to ask you about, again, the operationalization, or perhaps a more applied aspect of hope. It's really hope, the magic bullet, in the sense that there's really a correlation between the levels of hope and propensity for peace or conflict resolution, and even whether if we find a way to control those levels, whether this is something we should aspire to.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And the question, if I may rephrase, is like, does hope actually matter? Right? Does it matter? And here, there are several ways we could look at it. The first is really looking into our data and then analyzing it using all sorts of statistical models. We could identify the factors that are most likely to predict, for example, people's willingness to make compromises, people's willingness to be active in all sorts of peace initiatives, people's willingness to hear the other's narrative, right? There are all sorts of outcomes that we are looking for, and we could see which factor is the most robust predictor of these peace-promoting outcomes. And what I see across the board, this is true for Israelis, Palestinians. I have a running project in Cyprus, both in North Cyprus and in South Cyprus, among Greek and Cypriot, Greek and Turkish Cypriots that have been involved in conflict for a long time. Across the board, hope is the most robust predictors of people's willingness, and support for all these peace-promoting initiatives and ideas. So hope actually matters very, very much. But here we also need to understand that the power of hope needs to be manifested in action. one of the most interesting philosophical ideas about hope, that there is no such thing as passive hope, right? If you just hope for something, meaning you think that you want it and you think that it's possible, and do nothing about it, that's not hope. Okay, and this is, again, it's not me. Smarter philosophers than I really made it clear that hope could not be just an abstract idea. It has to be manifested in some behavior, even a small one. So the trick is now to take this and then translate it into some behavioral component, right? And by the way, one of the things, if we look at the situation in Israel right now, but for sure, in the last year, the movement in support of democracy in Israel was very, very active. And once you went, for example, to these demonstrations or programs or initiatives that this movement to save Israel's democracy, and it still is a huge movement, what did you feel? Hope, right? Because you actively engaged in something, you felt and experienced this hope. And I have to say, if I may, just one other point. Since the war broke out, one of the first things that happened on Saturday Eve, actually, several hours after the tragic attack on Israel began, that all of the movements that were a part of this movement for democracy said, okay, we're going to take all our resources, all of our people, all of the infrastructure, money, volunteers, everything, and devote everything to promote and support, the home front and then the battlefront, right? And what I did in these first days and still doing is volunteered in the many programs and initiatives that they had. I drove soldiers, to their bases. I went with my kids to, we prepared food in a restaurant and then shipped it into other places. And we're hosting a family that lived in the outskirts of the Gaza Strip in one of the kibbutzes, and they're at our house, and et cetera, et cetera. So all of these things don't only support, the general cause, but actually they bring back hope, right? They are hope. They are instilling hope among the people that are active in them.
But the question is whether all these things that are being done that are essentially domestic, it's like internal Israeli affairs at the moment, whether you think they can trickle into the Israeli-Palestinian context. In a way, what you're saying, if I read you correctly, you advocate for intersectionality, that activity on one front could well create a ripple effect on another front.
That's, yeah, first of all, yeah, there's a connection between them. And yesterday I heard Maoz Inon. I went to one of the demonstrations of the families of the hostages, and Maoz Inon, he lived in that area. His parents were killed 4 weeks ago in these atrocities in Netiv Asara, if I'm not mistaken. And he was there, right? Just lost his parents in this very, very tragic and unbelievable event. And he was talking about hope. He was talking from this pain, from this suffering. He was talking about hope. Hope about Israeli-Palestinian peace. Hope about a democratic Israel. Hope about, kind of packaging all these things together. And that was so inspiring. And people, not only me, all the people around were so inspired by this person. So we could take, we could take these examples, right? And then try as much as possible to use them to inspire ourselves to be active.
Yeah, if we're on the 7th of October event, so maybe we can really look at the recent history of the Gaza Strip in this respect, because it has been argued, not just in the last few weeks, but for some time, that Gaza is really a textbook example of how you keep people in the near complete absence of hope. It's been raised time and time again. And really, it's almost like, for one of your experiments, it's almost like laboratory conditions of how you keep people in the absence of hope. And now we saw the backlash in the form of the 7th of October massacre. How do you read these developments through your prism as someone who studied hope and its political repercussions?
Yeah, so first of all, let's again remind ourselves that atrocities on that day and then the days after, were so unbelievable in their scope and their cruelty, right? So really, we cannot diminish, the blow of this attack on many levels. Okay, and we are also still living it. So the events are unfolding. There are thousands of Gazians dead. Israeli soldiers are being, killed on a daily basis. Civilians are getting hurt. There are missiles flying into Israel. Israel is bombing the Gaza Strip. There are tensions on the North Front.
And hundreds of hostages.
And the hostages, of course. And we need to talk also about them because I think they are the most important issue now to understand and talk and promote. But first of all, we need to still understand that this was and still is a huge event, perhaps the most tragic event in the history of the conflict, right? So if we look at the history...
And that's hard to beat, yeah.
And that's hard to beat, right? So all the wars, etc., this is probably the most tragic and harmful event in the history of perhaps 100 years of conflict. And we need to remember that and not kind of take it aside. But then if we do want to look at, think about the causes, there are many, okay? But I do want to put the finger on one of your, about this topic of hope. If I compare the levels of hope for peace among Gazans and Palestinians in Gaza and Palestinians in the West Bank, and I did it just yesterday from my data, I see that their desires for peace, the Gazans' desires for peace, are higher than those in the West Bank. Perhaps because they are living in such dire circumstances, and for many years. But their expectations are so low, their belief in the possibility, their despair is so deep. This is perhaps one of the ways to explain what we're seeing now. Okay, and of course, it does not justify. We're trying to understand it, not, of course, give any excuses for it. But as political scientists and social scientists, we are trying to understand political and social phenomena. So this is one of the reasons, no doubt.
It's interesting now that I think about it, these two axes of hope, the feasibility and the desirability, are in a way contradictory, because if there's more, the desired outcome is more feasible, then the actual need for change that really feeds into the desire is diminished. So then there's less desire.
Right. So this is, again, this is very true. So one of the tricky parts, or hope is really, I have to say, I've been studying hope for more than a decade. And the concept and the idea, the philosophical and the also empirical ideas of hope are just becoming, for me, more fascinating. Right? But exactly, one of the things, let's think about, for example, two people that are sick, have severe diseases. Right? One person could be in a more difficult situation. Okay, so the belief in the possibility of his recovery might be low, but because he's feeling so sick, his desires, for recovery and being well are higher, and compared to someone that is relatively feeling okay. And if he feels okay, the possibility of recovery is higher, but the need and the desires and aspirations diminish. Right? What we need to do when we're talking about, this is true for the intractable conflict in Israel-Palestine, but surely very true to all sorts of times of crisis. I have to say that generally, people in the world are living now in a state of uncertainty. Right? So uncertainty in all sorts of ways, in all sorts of issues. We're talking about globalization and technology and migration and populism and the democratic backsliding, all sorts of phenomena that are detrimental phenomena that are kind of happening around us. And we live in an age of uncertainty. And when uncertainty, when this is the kind of the prism, hope is very, very relevant. So we both need to make sure that our desires are clear and and we remember them and don't diminish them. And the second, that these things are solvable. And the third thing I would add is be active, right? Being active is an essential ingredient in hope.
So if I'm reading you correctly, you're saying that after the 7th of October, there is more opportunity for promoting all those things, creating some sort of hope. I mean, we may have gone, there was some sort of setback in, the already lacking mutual trust between the two parties, etc. But there's, in every crisis, there's an opportunity, to use a cliche.
Right. So let's be clear, right? The default in these situations is for both sides to be even more entrenched in their self-righteousness, more entrenched in their distrust of the other person. Usually societies go more hardline and right-wing during these times, and that makes sense, right? But I also agree that there is an opportunity. In many ways, these types of shocks, these types of traumas could, from the ashes, right? You build something new. You change paradigms. I think one of the paradigms that people need to think about and are starting to think about, that the idea that we could continue without some policy or some agreement, and in this, it doesn't matter the configuration, but without some horizon for this type of, for a peace or conflict resolution, without that, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. It's not sustainable. People are getting killed, and the only thing, and this is something that I heard from Mao Zedong yesterday, right? That we need a horizon for some sort of resolution. Palestinians need it, Israelis need it, and this is this. So yeah. It might. I mean,
it's inescapable now. I mean, for a long time, Israelis at least, and some Palestinians, I'm guessing, also were under this impression that we can live a good life without addressing the Palestinian issue, and perhaps the fact that it blew up in our faces on the 7th of October is the much needed opportunity for a new paradigm.
Right, but again, it won't come by itself.
Of course,
right? People need to be active in pursuing it and advancing it.
Yeah. One last question, perhaps a broader one, a more general one. Is really about the methodology that you use, which is sort of a combination between philosophical and, as the subtitle says, the philosophical and psychological explorations. Can you talk about how they complement each other?
Yeah, so first of all, for me, I'm both kind of quant guy, collect data, run statistical models, experimental studies, etc., and use numbers and quantify things to understand them. But for me, not looking at the more philosophical sides, the abstract thoughts, is not looking at that. It's a problem. So for me, engaging in this, combining both philosophical kind of deliberations and statistical models is the ideal, that is the ideal pattern for me to study society and to study hope. And I also found it that when I'm talking, for example, I began to give lectures to non-academic audiences. So I lecture at universities and I have students, etc., and conferences, but I started to talk about hope to non-academic audience. And in my lectures, I don't only, talk about the philosophical ideas. I also present data that I collected in conflict zones around the world. And so I could exemplify and kind of make something more tangible also to myself and to my audiences or students or readers.
Can you give an example? What philosophical idea really shed light on the data in a way that you think?
I could give many examples. You need to read the book or come to my lectures. But just to give an example, we talked about uncertainty and unpredictability. One of the things that we don't like, all humans, is unpredictability. We want to think that the world is predictable and there is some certainty, but of course there isn't, right? People differ in their acceptance of uncertainty. Some people find it very hard to believe or to live at ease with the fact that the life is uncertain, and some people feel more comfortable with uncertainty. And we see, and this is true for Israelis, Palestinians, Turkish Cypriots, and Greek Cypriots, we see that people that are more at ease with uncertainty desire peace more. So because peace is uncertain and unpredictable, right? One of the tragic things about living in conflict is that conflict is, we know how it looks like, right? It's familiar. Right, Cypriots on both sides of the border know what the conflict is. Right, they don't really understand or remember what peace is. Also here in Israel, Palestine, of course. So when people are more at ease with uncertainty and unpredictability, they allow themselves to desire and aspire for peace more compared to people that that feel uncomfortable with uncertainty. And this is a philosophical idea that I translated into an empirical question and found evidence for that.
Yeah, what you just said reminded me of what an Israeli satirist said, actually quite a few years ago, following the end of the Oslo process, that everyone was talking, that's what he said, everyone's talking about the failure of the peace process, but why isn't anyone talking about the failure of the war process?
That's a good one.
There you go. Okay, Oded Adomi Leshem, professor of political psychology at the Hebrew University and author of the brand new book, Hope Amid Conflict, Philosophical and Psychological Explorations. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for hosting me. Thanks so much.
And many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request, because most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has probably close to 1,000 interviews by now. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from me here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.